August 1st, 1980, an express train left Dublin carrying 230 passengers heading south on a high summer afternoon. Minutes from Cork, a silent miscommunication snapped routine into disaster, and Ireland's deadliest rail tragedy unfolded at full speed. What signal changed everything, and why could it not be stopped? The answer begins with a single moment no one saw coming. At the 48-kilometer mark from Cork, the express train thundered south at nearly 97 kilometers per hour. Driver Bertie Walsh, hands steady on the controls, watched the track ahead. Familiar rails, familiar signals. The countryside blurred past in the high summer light. Then, in a single heartbeat, the signal ahead snapped from green to red. Walsh's training took over. Power was cut. The brake lever was thrown hard into emergency. His foot stamped down. The horn blared, a warning that echoed off the station buildings and the quiet fields beyond. But with the train's weight and speed, even perfect reflexes could not alter what physics demanded. A fully loaded express at 97 kilometers per hour needs nearly 700 meters to come to a halt on level track. The distance from the signal to the points at Buttevant was less than 400 meters. The brakes bit deep, steel grinding on steel, but the carriages surged forward with unstoppable force. Passengers felt the sudden deceleration. Drinks sloshed, cutlery rattled, conversations froze. In the cab, Walsh's eyes flicked from the speedometer to the track, calculating, measuring, knowing. He sounded the horn again, a long, desperate blast. The siding loomed closer, the stationary ballast train visible now, impossibly close. Inside the first carriages, travelers braced against seats and tables, some barely registering the danger until the final moments. Outside, the signalman at the switch held his ground until the last possible second, then leaped clear as the express roared past. There was no more time for warnings or corrections. The locomotive's momentum carried it onto the siding, the rails shuddering under the strain. Impact was now certain. No action, no skill, no last-minute decision could prevent it. In those final seconds, every procedure had been followed, every protocol observed, but the outcome was locked in by the limits of speed, distance, and the laws of motion. The moment of impact tore through the train's front carriages with a force that shattered wood, twisted steel, and filled the station yard with a thunderous roar. The locomotive stayed upright, but the ballast wagons ahead jackknifed violently, scattering splinters and debris. The first two wooden-bodied coaches, caught between the engine and the heavier steel cars behind, crumpled almost instantly. Windows burst, seats splintered, and the sudden compression left no time for those inside to react. In the rear coaches, the shock arrived as a violent jolt. Startled passengers found drinks still upright, luggage undisturbed, the catastrophe at the front hidden by distance and disbelief. Smoke drifted above the wreckage. For a moment there was only silence, broken by distant shouts and the hiss of ruptured pipes. Then survivors began to climb down onto the tracks, some dazed, others bleeding, their faces marked by shock and confusion. Driver Bertie Walsh, battered but conscious, forced himself out of the cab. He moved down the line, setting detonators along the rail to warn any approaching trains, an old railwayman's instinct, even as pain flared in his side. At the nearby level crossing, Dr. Finbar Kennedy had been waiting in his car. He heard the crash, saw the rising dust, and ran toward the wreck. Within minutes, he began triage on the ballast beside the rails, moving from one injured passenger to the next, his hands steady as he worked through the chaos. Word spread quickly. Villagers, farm workers, and builders left fields and workshops, crossing hedges and fences to reach the site. They brought blankets, ladders, and whatever tools they could find, forming impromptu rescue teams that pulled survivors from the tangled carriages and comforted the wounded. Emergency services converged as the scale of the disaster became clear. More than 20 ambulances arrived from Cork, Limerick, and beyond. A helicopter originally en route from Galway to Cork spotted the wreckage from the air, landed in a nearby field, and began ferrying the most severely injured to hospital. Over 5 hours, the helicopter made repeated trips, supplementing the ground response. Nearly 200 off-duty doctors, nurses, and medical staff volunteered, many arriving in their own cars after hearing urgent appeals on local radio. By nightfall, the last of the injured had been evacuated, and makeshift command posts lined the station approach. In the midst of confusion and loss, the emergency community response was swift, determined, and deeply human. Temporary points had been installed at Buttevant station 4 months earlier to allow maintenance trains to shunt between the main line and a siding. These were not the standard remotely controlled points found elsewhere on the Dublin-to-Cork corridor. Instead, they relied on a simple, hand-thrown lever operated directly beside the track. Once moved, a wooden wedge was hammered into place to hold the rails in position. There was no mechanical interlock connecting these points to the signal cabin. The signalman could not set or check their alignment from his post. He had to trust what was done on the ground. The points themselves were of the 1 to 8 facing type, meaning the rails diverged at a relatively gentle angle, enough for trains to cross safely at low speed, but not designed for express services passing at nearly 100 kilometers per hour. The absence of interlocking meant that the safety of every passing train depended entirely on clear communication and manual confirmation between the signalman and the points crew. If the points were set incorrectly, there was no automatic safeguard to prevent a disaster. A signal could show green for the main line even if the rails ahead were physically set to the siding. On the day of the crash, the manual system's vulnerability became critical. The points were adjusted by hand, locked with a wedge, and left ready for a planned shunting move. But the process allowed for human error at every stage. There was no electrical check, no feedback loop, and no physical barrier to a route set incorrectly. In a busy station yard with multiple trains expected and maintenance work ongoing, this reliance on manual levers and wedges exposed a gap in the chain of safety. The equipment, designed as a temporary measure, demanded precision and vigilance, but offered no backup if either failed. Inside the signal cabin at Buttevant, the minutes before the crash unfolded in a blur of routine and sudden alarm. The pointsman, expecting a shunting locomotive, set the temporary points to the siding without waiting for the signalman's explicit clearance. This ordinary act in maintenance work sent the rails toward disaster. The signalman, glancing out the window, spotted the incorrectly set points too late. He ordered them thrown back to the main line and turned the signals to danger, but the express was already bearing down at full speed. The reversal required time the crew no longer had. The lever was wrenched, the wedge hammered free, and only seconds remained. The signalman stayed at his post until the last possible moment, jumping clear as the train thundered past, unable to halt what had begun. The collision's violence was shaped not only by speed and steel, but by the composition of the train itself. The first 2 carriages behind the locomotive were wooden-bodied, relics from an earlier era. When the engine struck the stationary ballast wagons, these wooden coaches bore the brunt of the force. They collapsed instantly, their frames splintering under the weight of the steel coaches behind, which surged forward with unstoppable momentum. The wooden carriages offered little resistance. Their bodies crumpled, floors buckled, and passengers inside had no protection from the crushing impact. In seconds, the front of the train was reduced to wreckage. 18 lives were lost, 17 at the scene and 1 later in hospital. Over 70 more were injured, some suffering wounds that would linger for years. Survivors from the rear coaches emerged into a world forever changed, carrying memories of a disaster that began with a misunderstood instruction and ended in irreversible loss. The inquiry that followed would trace every order, every lever, every word exchanged between the signalmen, but the human cost was already written in the silence that settled over Buttevant that afternoon. Every time a train departs, safety depends on precision, never assumption. In Ireland today, steel replaces wood and protocols are stricter, but human error still lurks. Systems evolve, yet vigilance remains our last defense. The cost of a late signal is measured in lives, not minutes. Stay curious. History's lessons protect tomorrow.